The morning of October 6th, 1789, arrives cold and gray over the palace grounds. Fog drifts across the gardens like gauze drawn over a wound. Inside the Queen's bedchamber, Marie Antoinette has barely slept. Through the night, she has listened to the sounds of a kingdom turning against itself. The distant roar of voices, the rhythmic tramping of feet on gravel paths that were never meant to bear such traffic. The mob from Paris, some 20,000 strong, has breached the gates. They have killed guardsmen in the corridors. They have demanded bread and blood in equal measure. For 107 years, this palace has stood as the supreme expression of royal power, a monument so vast and magnificent that visiting diplomats have been known to weep at the sight of it. Every surface gilded, every fountain engineered to defy gravity, every hedge trimmed to geometric perfection, all of it designed to communicate a single unassailable message. The King of France answers to no one but God. And yet, on this gray October morning, the message has failed. The palace that was built to project invincibility has been revealed as what it always was, a beautiful shell, impossibly expensive to maintain, surrounded by a nation that can no longer afford to feed itself. The Queen flees through a hidden passage to the King's apartments. The royal family will leave Versailles that afternoon, escorted by the crowd back to Paris. They will never return. The palace falls silent. Rain begins to fall on the empty parterre gardens, pooling in the basin of the Latona fountain where no water plays. The great rooms grow cold. Dust settles on the parquet floors. And France begins the long, bloody work of reimagining what a nation can be. This is the story of how one of humanity's most extraordinary achievements became one of history's most profound warnings. A palace that was meant to glorify a dynasty instead bankrupted it. A home designed to project eternal power became, within a century, a prison from which there was no escape. The Palace of Versailles is not merely beautiful. It is beautiful in a way that exhausted a treasury, broke the backs of laborers, and planted the seeds of revolution in soil that should have grown gardens. To understand Versailles is to understand that magnificence always has a price, and that the bill, sooner or later, comes due. To comprehend what Versailles became, one must first understand what it was before. In the early 17th century, the site was unremarkable, a modest hunting lodge surrounded by marshland and forest, approximately 20 kilometers southwest of Paris. The terrain was poor for agriculture, prone to flooding, and avoided by those who could afford better ground. The air was thick with mosquitoes in summer, and the water supply was neither abundant nor particularly clean. It was, in short, the last place any reasonable architect would choose to build one of history's greatest palaces. But Louis XIV was not interested in reasonable choices. He was interested in power, its projection, its consolidation, and its permanence. And the unremarkable terrain of Versailles offered him something no existing palace could, a blank canvas upon which to inscribe his vision of monarchy, unencumbered by the compromises and associations of sites already laden with history. The young Louis had spent his childhood in fear. The Fronde, a series of civil wars that convulsed France between 1648 and 1653, had taught him lessons he would never forget. He had experienced the terror of fleeing Paris in the night as a boy of 10, his mother's hand gripping his as their carriage rattled through streets thick with enemies. He had known what it meant to be a king who could not trust his own nobles, could not rely on his own capital, could not sleep soundly in his own palace. The Fronde was crushed eventually. Louis's mother and Cardinal Mazarin restored order and secured the throne. But the boy who had hidden in cold corridors while his kingdom tore itself apart never vanished entirely. He remained there, buried beneath the increasingly elaborate persona of the Sun King, whispering a warning that the adult monarch would spend his life answering, "Never again." Never again would French nobles have the power or the opportunity to threaten the crown. Never again would Paris, that uncontrollable, unpredictable city, hold the royal family hostage to the whims of mobs and factions. Versailles was the answer to those whispered fears. By building a new center of power far from Paris, by creating a palace so magnificent that every ambitious nobleman in France would be compelled to attend, Louis XIV was not merely constructing a home. He was constructing a trap, a gilded cage in which the aristocracy would be kept too close to scheme, too occupied with ritual and competition to organize rebellion, and too financially dependent on royal favor to risk the king's displeasure. The genius of the plan lay in its simplicity. If you could not destroy the power of the nobility outright, you could redirect it. You could channel the ambition, the pride, the rivalrous energies of France's greatest families into an endless performance of courtly etiquette, a performance over which only the king could preside and from which only the king could benefit. The palace would be the stage, the nobility would be the players, and Louis XIV would be the author, director, and sole audience that truly mattered. Work began in earnest in 1661, the year Louis declared his intention to rule without a chief minister. He was 22 years old, and the scope of his ambition was not yet fully apparent. The initial goal was relatively modest: expand and improve the existing hunting lodge, making it suitable for longer royal visits and more elaborate entertainments. But modest goals have a tendency to grow when resources appear unlimited. By 1664, Louis was hosting the first of his grand fêtes, elaborate multi-day festivals involving theater, music, fireworks, and feasting, and already the existing structures proved inadequate to his vision. The first major expansion began. Gardens were laid out under the direction of André Le Nôtre. New wings were added to the lodge. Fountains were commissioned, requiring engineers to solve problems that had never been attempted at such scale. By 1668, the second building campaign was underway. Louis Laveau, the premier architect, designed the famous envelope, a new structure that wrapped around the original hunting lodge, transforming what had been a modest brick building into something approaching grandeur. The materials changed. Marble replaced brick, stone replaced wood. The scale increased with each passing year. By 1678, with the Treaty of Nijmegen ending the Franco-Dutch War, Louis felt secure enough in his military victories to pour truly staggering resources into his palace. Jules Hardouin Mansart succeeded Laveau as chief architect, and the greatest expansion began. The Hall of Mirrors, the north and south wings, the Royal Chapel, Trianon, the great stables that could house more than 2,000 horses, the orangery that would winter more than 1,000 exotic trees. The numbers from this period strain credulity. At the height of construction, more than 30,000 workers labored simultaneously on the site. Some were skilled craftsmen, stonemasons, gilders, painters, sculptors, hydraulic engineers. But many were simply laborers, peasants pressed into service, soldiers reassigned from armies that had no current war to fight. They dug foundations in frozen ground. They drained marshes that bred disease. They hauled stone from quarries as far as 80 kilometers away. The human cost was catastrophic. No comprehensive records survive of how many workers died during Versailles' construction, but contemporary accounts suggest the toll was immense. Malaria from the undrained marshlands, accidents with the massive machinery required to move stone and marble, collapse of scaffolding and temporary structures, men crushed beneath the weight of materials meant to glorify a king they would never meet in rooms they would never enter. The wagons came ceaselessly, marble from Reims and Campagne, stone from Saint-Lô and Conflans, wood from the great forests of France and beyond. Lead for the roofing, mined and smelted and transported in quantities that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. Glass from the royal manufactories, perfected specifically to supply the 578 mirrors that would line the most famous gallery in the world. Every decision was a statement. The Hall of Mirrors, stretching 73 meters along the garden facade, was not merely beautiful. It was a deliberate technological demonstration. For decades, Venice had held a monopoly on high-quality mirror production, a monopoly that France resented and that Louis was determined to break. The creation of the Hall of Mirrors required the development of a domestic mirror industry, the recruitment of Venetian craftsmen, and the perfection of techniques that had been state secrets for generations. When visitors walked through the gallery, they were not simply admiring reflections. They were witnessing the power of the French state to bend technology, craft, and commerce to the royal will. But of all the technical challenges Versailles presented, none was more complex or more financially devastating than water. Louis XIV was obsessed with fountains. He saw in their endless play a metaphor for his own reign, a constant demonstration that nature itself could be commanded, that water could be made to dance at the pleasure of a king. The gardens of Versailles were designed around water. 1,400 fountains at the peak of the garden's development, ranging from modest jets to enormous theatrical displays featuring mythological figures in bronze and lead, water ascending in columns and arcs, cascading down artificial rockwork, filling the air with a sound Louis believed represented the very music of power. The problem was that Versailles had no water, or rather, it had profoundly insufficient water. The site sat on a plateau with poor natural drainage and no significant springs or rivers nearby. Every drop that fed the fountains had to be brought from elsewhere, stored, lifted, channeled, and precisely controlled. The system required to accomplish this remains one of the most ambitious hydraulic engineering projects in history. Initial solutions proved inadequate almost immediately. Pumping stations were constructed along the Seine at Marly, including the famous Marly machine, a massive apparatus of 14 water wheels driving more than 250 pumps, designed to lift water 160 meters above the river and send it through an aqueduct to the palace. At its peak, the Marly machine was considered one of the mechanical wonders of the world. Visitors came from across Europe to witness its impossible complexity, its thousands of moving parts groaning and clanking as they forced the river uphill. But even this marvel could not supply enough water to run all the fountains simultaneously. The solution was as pragmatic as it was absurd. An army of garden workers stationed throughout the grounds with a system of secret signals, whistles, flags, coded messages, would alert each other to the king's movements. As Louis approached a particular fountain, it would be activated. As he moved away, it would fall silent. The king walked through an illusion of endless abundance, never realizing, or perhaps choosing not to acknowledge, that the display was as carefully choreographed as any theatrical performance. The cost of maintaining this illusion was staggering. Engineers proposed increasingly ambitious schemes to bring more water to Versailles. One plan, partially executed before being abandoned, sought to divert the Eure River, a tributary of the Seine located more than 80 kilometers away. The project required the construction of an enormous aqueduct, comparable in scale to the great works of ancient Rome. Tens of thousands of soldiers were diverted from military duties to work on the construction. Thousands died of malaria in the swampy terrain. After years of labor and expenditure, counted in the tens of millions of livres, the project was abandoned when war with the League of Augsburg demanded the soldiers return to military service. The aqueduct was never completed. The foundations remain today, crumbling monuments to an ambition that even the Sun King could not sustain. To walk through Versailles today is to experience a carefully curated version of its history, the version the palace wishes to present. The tourists who shuffle through the state apartments, who crane their necks at the painted ceilings and jostle for photographs before the Hall of Mirrors, encounter a space that has been cleaned, restored, and rendered safe for modern consumption. What they do not see is the vast hidden infrastructure that made life at Versailles possible, an infrastructure that was, in its own way, as remarkable as the gilded surfaces above. Begin with the simple question of heat. The palace contains more than 2,000 windows, single-glazed in an era before central heating. The winters of the late 17th and early 18th centuries were often brutal. The winter of 1709 was so severe that wine froze in the carafes at the king's own table, that the ink froze in courtiers' pens before they could finish their letters. Heating a building of Versailles' size required an army of specialized workers and a logistics chain extending across France. Hundreds of fireplaces, some estimates place the number at over 700, burned continuously through the cold months. The fuel came from forests owned by the crown, but even royal forests could not sustainably supply Versailles' appetite. Wood was floated down rivers, carted overland, stored in massive yards, dried to proper burning condition, cut to size, and distributed by servants who moved through the palace's hidden passages. A network of corridors and staircases deliberately designed to be invisible from the state apartments, ensuring that the nobility would never be confronted with the labor that sustained their comfort. The hidden passages are themselves a marvel of design. Behind the painted walls, above the gilded ceilings, a parallel world existed, narrow corridors through which servants could move swiftly, carrying food, fuel, chamber pots, and messages. These passages connected to storage areas, kitchens, laundries, and the humble lodgings where the palace's vast servant class lived in conditions that bore no resemblance to the splendor they maintained. At its peak, the court of Versailles contained between 10 and 20,000 people, the number fluctuating with the calendar of royal events and the presence or absence of the broader nobility. The feeding of this population was a logistical undertaking comparable to supplying a military campaign. Meat came from designated purveyors who maintained herds specifically for the court. Fish was transported in water-filled tanks to keep it fresh. Exotic fruits and vegetables were grown in the potager du roi, the king's kitchen garden, where Jean-Baptiste de la Cantigny developed new techniques for extending growing seasons and producing out-of-season delicacies. The kitchens operated around the clock. The meals of the king alone required specialized staff, officers in charge of the royal tablecloth, officers in charge of the royal bread, officers in charge of the royal wine. Each position was a coveted appointment, conferring prestige and, more importantly, opportunities for profit. The entire system was riddled with what modern observers might call corruption, but what contemporaries understood as the natural perquisites of office: the right to skim a percentage, to sell surplus, to extract fees from those who sought access to royal favor. Sanitation was a perpetual challenge. The palace's plumbing was rudimentary by modern standards, and the presence of thousands of people generated waste on an industrial scale. Chamber pots were emptied by servants, their contents disposed of in cesspits that required regular maintenance. The smell of Versailles, according to contemporary accounts, was often overpowering. A pungent mix of perfume, wood smoke, cooking, unwashed bodies, and human waste that no amount of incense could fully disguise. The gardens, too, required an army of maintenance workers, gardeners who trimmed the hedges with geometric precision, laborers who maintained the gravel paths, specialists who tended the exotic plants in the greenhouses, workers who kept the fountains and their complex machinery in operating condition. The formal gardens covered approximately 800 hectares, a vast artificial landscape that was never allowed to relax into natural growth. Every blade of grass, every jet of water, every gilded surface represented not a single act of creation, but a continuous, expensive, labor-intensive commitment. Versailles was not built once. It was built every day, rebuilt every day, maintained against the ceaseless erosion of time, weather, and use. Who was the man who set all this in motion? Who conceived a vision so grandiose that an entire kingdom would be bent to its realization? Louis XIV was born in 1638, the unexpected son of a marriage that had seemed barren for more than 20 years. His arrival was considered miraculous, literally so, in an age when divine providence was the default explanation for the inexplicable. He was called Louis Dieudonné, Louis the God-given. From his first breath, he was burdened with significance, expected to embody not merely a dynasty but a divine plan. His childhood, as noted, was marked by the trauma of the Fronde, but it was also marked by something else: an education in the theatrical nature of power. His godfather, Cardinal Mazarin, was a master of political manipulation, a man who understood that authority is as much performance as substance. Louis learned from Mazarin that a king must always be seen to be in control, even when, especially when, control is tenuous. The appearance of power is itself a form of power. This lesson shaped everything Louis would build. Versailles was not merely a residence, it was a stage. The elaborate rituals of court life, the lever, the king's rising, the cowsher, the king's bedtime, the grand couvert, the king's public dining, were not mere ceremonies, but carefully choreographed performances in which the king's body became the symbolic center of the realm. Consider the lever. Each morning, the king's awakening was a formal event, attended by designated courtiers in strict hierarchical order. The first to enter were the grands entrées, princes of the blood, high officials, personal favorites. Then came the premières entrées, the entrée de la chambre, the lesser entries. Each tier of attendants represented a graduated privilege, a mark of royal favor that could be granted, withdrawn, or withheld as an instrument of control. The mere right to hold the king's shirt during the dressing ceremony was a prize for which great families competed with fierce intensity. It seems absurd to modern sensibilities, grown men and women scheming and flattering and spending fortunes for the chance to perform what was essentially a servant's duty. But that was precisely the point. By making such rituals the currency of status, Louis transformed the competitive energies of the nobility from dangerous political maneuvering into harmless social jockeying. A nobleman consumed with the question of whether he would be invited to the king's petit couvert, a smaller, more intimate dining occasion, was a nobleman with no attention to spare for plotting rebellion. Louis himself seems to have understood with remarkable clarity what he was doing. In the memoirs he composed for the instruction of his son, though largely ghost-written, they reflect his views. He explained his philosophy of rule, that kings must work constantly at the business of being kings, that public display is itself a form of governance, that the monarch's visibility ensures the stability of the realm. He was not a stupid man. He was not merely a vain man, though vanity was certainly among his attributes. He was a calculating man who had identified the central problem of French monarchy, the fractious, powerful, perpetually restive nobility, and had devised an architectural solution of astonishing comprehensiveness. The cost, of course, was staggering, but for most of Louis's reign, the cost seemed sustainable, or at least deferrable. France was the wealthiest and most populous nation in Europe. Its agricultural output was enormous. Its manufactures, silk, textiles, porcelain, glass, were the envy of the continent. Its military was the most formidable in the Western world. What Louis could not see, or chose not to see, was that he was spending not merely his current revenues, but his future ones. He was borrowing against harvests not yet planted, manufacturing capacity not yet developed, generations not yet born. The accounting that would reveal this truth was still decades away, but the debts were accumulating, year by year, season by season, fountain by fountain, war by war. The wars are inseparable from the story of Versailles. Louis XIV conducted France into nearly 50 years of armed conflict during his personal reign. The War of Devolution, the Franco-Dutch War, the War of the Reunions, the 9 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession. Each war had its justifications, its strategic logic, its moments of triumph. But each war also had its costs, costs that mounted even as the victories became less decisive and the terms of peace less favorable. The War of the Spanish Succession, which consumed the final years of Louis's reign, was catastrophic. When the Habsburg King of Spain died in 1700, leaving his throne to Louis's grandson, it seemed like a magnificent diplomatic triumph. The combined power of France and Spain would dominate Europe. Instead, it provoked a continental coalition determined to prevent such hegemony. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and various German states united against France. The war lasted 13 years. France suffered devastating defeats at Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, and Malplaquet. The treasury, already strained, was emptied. The currency was debased. Taxation reached levels that sparked unrest even among populations accustomed to heavy burdens. At Versailles, the gilded surfaces began to tarnish, metaphorically, if not yet literally. The famous silver furniture that had adorned the state apartments, tables, chandeliers, balustrades of solid, precious metal, was melted down to pay for the war. Louis issued instructions that the nobility should follow his example, surrendering their own silver. It was a gesture of solidarity, but it was also a confession. The wealth that had seemed inexhaustible was, in fact, exhaustible. The winter of 1709 delivered another blow. It was one of the coldest in European memory. Rivers froze to depths that had never been recorded. The Seine froze solid. The harbor at Marseille froze. More critically, the winter wheat, the foundation of the French food supply, was killed in the fields by the frost. Famine followed. Thousands died of starvation or of diseases exacerbated by malnutrition. The price of bread, already a source of chronic popular anger, became literally unaffordable for much of the population. At Versailles, the fountains froze and cracked. The cold seeped through the inadequate windows, defeating even the hundreds of constantly burning fireplaces. Louis, now 70 years old, continued his rituals, rising before his courtiers, dining in public, conducting the business of the realm. But those who observed him closely noted that the performance had grown hollow. He was presiding over the slow collapse of everything he had built. When peace finally came in 1713 and 1714, the terms were humiliating. France retained some of its gains but surrendered others. Louis's grandson kept the Spanish throne, but only on condition that the French and Spanish crowns would never be united. The dream of European hegemony was finished. Louis died on September 1st, 1715, 4 days before his 77th birthday. His reign had lasted 72 years, the longest of any European monarch in recorded history. He had outlived his son, his eldest grandson, and his eldest great-grandson. The throne passed to his 5-year-old great-grandson, Louis XV, whose long minority would be governed by a regent who promptly moved the court back to Paris, abandoning Versailles as if fleeing a curse. The palace stood empty. The fountains did not play. The gardens began, slowly, to grow wild. It would be easy to end the story here, to present Versailles as a cautionary tale completed in 1715, a monument to hubris that collapsed under its own weight. But history is rarely so tidy. Versailles was not abandoned permanently. The court returned. The palace was inhabited for another 74 years, through the entire reign of Louis XIV and much of the reign of Louis XIV. The story continued, and in continuing, it deepened and complicated itself. Louis XV was, by temperament, a very different man than his great-grandfather. Where Louis XIV had been a tireless public performer, Louis XV was shy, prone to melancholy, and uncomfortable in crowds. He hated the public ceremonies that had been the previous reign's method of control. He preferred hunting in the forests around Versailles to presiding over the lever and coucher. He sought refuge in smaller, more intimate spaces, creating for himself a private world within the public palace. The construction that characterized Louis XV's reign reflected this inwardness. Rather than building more grand galleries, he built the petit appartement, a series of smaller rooms tucked behind and above the state apartments where he could escape the perpetual public performance of kingship. These rooms were exquisitely decorated but deliberately modest in scale, designed for comfort rather than spectacle. The famous Trianon complex also grew during this period. Marie Antoinette, who came to Versailles as the wife of the future Louis XVI, would eventually make the Petit Trianon her personal refuge, a place where she could pretend for a few hours at a time that she was not a queen, but merely a woman, playing at rustic life in a mock village where peasants did not starve and politics did not exist. The financial situation, meanwhile, continued to deteriorate. Louis XIV's wars were less extensive than Louis XIV's, but they were no less costly relative to the realm's diminished capacity. The 7 Years' War, which saw France lose its North American colonies to Britain, was a military and financial disaster. The debt accumulated under Louis XIV, rather than being reduced, continued to grow. Interest payments consumed an ever larger share of royal revenue. Attempts at reform were consistently blocked by entrenched interests. The French tax system was a catastrophe of exemptions, exceptions, and inequities. The nobility and clergy were largely exempt from direct taxation. The burden fell disproportionately on those least able to pay, peasants and the urban poor, while those with the greatest wealth contributed the least. Any attempt to reform this system was met with fierce resistance from the privileged orders who stood to lose. The Parlement, the regional courts that had the power to register royal edicts, repeatedly blocked reform measures claiming to defend ancient liberties while in fact defending ancient privileges. Louis XIV, frustrated and increasingly fatalistic, is reported to have said, "Après moi le déluge," after me, the flood. Whether he actually uttered these words is uncertain, but they captured the mood of a reign that had given up on solutions and was merely waiting for the inevitable. Louis XVI, who succeeded his grandfather in 1774, was an earnest, well-meaning man who was catastrophically unsuited to the crisis he inherited. He was awkward in public, indecisive in council, and more interested in locksmithing than in statecraft. He understood that reform was necessary but lacked the political skill to implement it against the resistance of those who benefited from the existing system. His queen, Marie Antoinette, became a lightning rod for popular anger. She was Austrian, which made her suspect in a nation with a long history of Habsburg conflict. She was extravagant, or at least perceived to be extravagant, at a moment when the nation could not afford extravagance. The diamond necklace affair, in which he was falsely accused of involvement in a spectacular fraud, destroyed what remained of her reputation, even though she was entirely innocent. Meanwhile, France's intervention in the American Revolution, strategically successful in weakening Britain, deeply popular in principle, proved financially catastrophic in practice. The cost of supplying and transporting an army across the Atlantic, of maintaining a fleet capable of challenging British naval supremacy, was immense. The national debt, already crushing, grew to a size that could no longer be sustained. By the mid-1780s, the Crown was spending more than half its revenue on debt service alone. Ordinary functions of government, defense, administration, justice, were starved of funds. The situation was, in the language of the time, at extremity. Various finance ministers attempted increasingly desperate remedies. Loans were floated at ruinous interest rates, currency was debased, offices were sold, but nothing was sufficient. The structural reform that was needed, a fair tax system, a rationalized administration, constraints on aristocratic privilege, remained politically impossible. In 1789, facing imminent bankruptcy, Louis XIV summoned the Estates General, an assembly of representatives from the three orders, clergy, nobility, and commoners, that had not met since 1614. It was an acknowledgement of failure. The king could not solve this crisis alone. He needed the consent and cooperation of the nation. What he got instead was revolution. The story of 1789 is too complex to summarize here in its full political and ideological dimensions, but Versailles stood at the center of it. The Estates General met in the palace itself in the Salle des Menus Plaisirs. When the Third Estate, the commoners, declared themselves the National Assembly and swore not to disband until they had given France a constitution, they did so on a tennis court within the palace complex. The Women's March of October 1789, with which this narration began, brought the crisis to its climax. The palace that had been built to overawe, to intimidate, to make the power of the monarchy seem eternal and unassailable, had failed. The crowd that invaded its grounds was not overawed. They were hungry, angry, and no longer willing to accept that a palace eating the wealth of a nation should continue to stand while their children starved. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette left Versailles that October afternoon and never returned. The palace was stripped of its furnishings in a series of revolutionary sales. The great collections of art and furniture were dispersed, some lost forever, others eventually finding their way to museums around the world. The building itself was preserved, though proposals were made to demolish it entirely as a symbol of tyranny. What saved Versailles, paradoxically, was its very enormity. It was too large, too expensive, too complex to destroy easily. And despite the revolutionary fervor, there was a sense, dimly articulated but real, that something of value existed here beyond its association with the monarchy. The palace was a national creation, built with national labor and national treasure. To destroy it would be to destroy a part of France itself. The decades that followed were chaotic. Revolutionary governments came and went. Napoleon rose, conquered, and fell. The Bourbons were restored, then overthrown again. Each regime had its own relationship with Versailles, its own ideas about what the palace meant and what should be done with it. Napoleon briefly considered making it an imperial residence, but ultimately decided against it. The scale was too vast even for his ambitions, and the associations with the old regime too troublesome. Instead, he undertook partial restorations while leaving the palace largely uninhabited. The Bourbon restoration brought renewed interest but limited funds. Louis XIII and Charles VI entertained nostalgic visions of return, but the political climate made a full restoration of Versailles' courtly functions impossible. The July monarchy of Louis Philippe, which replaced the Bourbons in 1830, took a different approach. Rather than restore Versailles as a royal residence, Louis Philippe transformed it into a museum dedicated à toutes les gloires de la France, to all the glories of France. This transformation was, in its own way, as radical as anything the revolutionaries had done. The intimate apartments where kings had dressed and dined were converted into galleries. The private bedchambers became public spaces, paintings commemorating French military victories, from medieval times through Napoleon's empire, covered walls that had previously displayed Louis XIV's allegorical triumphs. The conversion was controversial then, and remains controversial now. Much original decoration was destroyed or covered to make way for the new museum functions. The palace's coherence as a historical document was compromised in ways that later restoration efforts would struggle to address. But the conversion also gave Versailles a new purpose, a new justification for continued investment, a new reason to exist in a France that no longer had kings. Through the Second Empire, the Third Republic, and into the 20th century, Versailles evolved. It hosted significant political events, the proclamation of the German Empire in 1871 in a calculated humiliation staged in the Hall of Mirrors after France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919, ending World War I, was signed in the same hall, a deliberate reversal and erasure of the earlier shame. But maintenance continued to be a struggle. Republican France had many demands on its budget, and a palace associated with monarchy was never going to be a priority. The building deteriorated. The gardens grew more ragged. By the mid-20th century, Versailles was showing its age in ways that alarmed conservators and historians. The creation of the Établissement Public du Château, du Musée et du Domaine National de Versailles, a public institution with its own budget and mandate, was an attempt to address this decline. But the challenges were and remain immense. Consider the scale of what must be maintained. The palace contains 2,300 rooms. The roof covers approximately 67,000 square meters. The gardens extend across more than 800 hectares. There are more than 350,000 trees, more than 200,000 flowers replanted each year, more than 50 fountains that require constant attention. The Hall of Mirrors alone presents preservation challenges that would be overwhelming for many museums. Its 357 mirrors are not the originals. Those were replaced multiple times over the centuries, but even modern replacements deteriorate. The painted ceiling, completed by Charles Le Brun and his workshop in the 1680s, required a comprehensive restoration in the early 2000s that took more than 5 years and cost millions of euros. Every surface in Versailles presents its own conservation challenges. The gilding must be maintained against wear and atmospheric degradation. The textiles, silks, brocades, tapestries, are inherently fragile and damaged by light, dust, and the very presence of millions of visitors each year. The parquet floors, laid with precision by 18th century craftsmen, must be protected against modern foot traffic that vastly exceeds anything the original builders anticipated. Water remains a challenge. The fountain infrastructure, while no longer relying on the Marley machine, which ceased operation in the 19th century, still requires constant attention. The Grande perspective alone, the main axis extending from the palace to the Grand Canal, includes fountains that consume approximately 3,000 cubic meters of water per hour when fully operational. The water is now recycled rather than drawn fresh, but the pumping systems, the pipes, the valves, the basins themselves all require ongoing maintenance. Heating is approached differently than in Louis XIV's era. Modern climate control systems have been installed, threading through the building in ways designed to be as unobtrusive as possible. The goal is not merely comfort, but conservation, maintaining stable temperature and humidity conditions that slow the deterioration of irreplaceable artworks and surfaces. The staffing requirements are enormous. The établissement public employs approximately 1,000 permanent staff: curators, conservators, gardeners, guards, administrators, guides, maintenance workers. During peak tourist seasons, additional temporary workers are brought in. The payroll represents a significant portion of the operating budget. And then there is security. A site of Versailles' cultural significance and public accessibility is an obvious target for theft, vandalism, and terrorism. The security operation is sophisticated and expensive, involving guards, surveillance systems, controlled access points, and coordination with national police and intelligence services. How is all of this paid for? Paid. The answer is, with great difficulty, through a combination of government subsidy, earned revenue, private donations, and commercial activities that would have astonished the Sun King. Government support provides a foundation, but not a complete solution. The French state allocates funds for major restoration projects, but these funds are never sufficient to address all needs simultaneously. The result is a perpetual process of triage. Which roof sections are most urgently in need of repair? Which paintings are most endangered? Which structural concerns pose the greatest safety risks? Earned revenue has become increasingly important. Versailles charges admission, and with more than 10 million visitors in a typical year, the ticket revenue is substantial. But balancing the need for revenue against the preservation concerns created by mass tourism is a constant tension. Every visitor who walks through the Hall of Mirrors is, in some small way, contributing to the floor's deterioration, to the pollution of the indoor air, to the wear on door frames and stairways. Private donations and corporate sponsorship have become essential supplements. Major restoration projects are frequently named for their donors: the Dior Galleries, the Rolex restoration of the Queen's Chambers. These partnerships are carefully negotiated, balancing the institution's need for funds against its responsibility to maintain scholarly independence and historical integrity. Commercial activities have expanded dramatically. There are gift shops, of course, but also restaurants, event venues, film location rentals, and branded merchandise licensing. The gardens of Versailles have become a favored setting for fashion shoots, corporate events, and society weddings, activities that would have scandalized preservationists a generation ago, but that are now accepted as necessary compromises in the palace's survival strategy. The Grand Canal has been rented for private parties. The Opera House has hosted commercial concerts. The gardens have been transformed for special occasions into exhibition spaces for contemporary art installations that spark fierce debate about appropriateness and mission. Each of these commercial activities represents a trade-off. They generate revenue essential for preservation, but they also change the character of the site, introducing modern commercial dynamics into a space that was designed to express a very different set of values. The question of how far this commercialization should be allowed to proceed has no easy answer. Return, for a moment, to the present day. Walk the gardens in early morning before the crowds arrive. The gravel paths are freshly raked, the hedges precise, the fountains silent but ready. The palace rises in the distance, its facades restored to something approaching their original appearance, the gilt on the gates catching the first light. It is undeniably beautiful. It remains one of the most remarkable achievements in human history, an act of collective creation involving thousands of artisans, laborers, engineers, and artists over multiple generations. The skill embedded in every surface, the ambition expressed in every vista, the sheer audacity of imagining such a place and then making it real, these deserve admiration, even awe. And yet, knowledge of the cost accompanies every moment of appreciation. Those gardens were laid out by laborers who died of fever in undrained marshes. Those fountains consumed resources that might have fed families, educated children, built hospitals. The glory of the Hall of Mirrors was purchased with silver furniture, melted to pay for wars of dynastic ambition. The final decades of the palace's function as a royal residence occurred against a backdrop of mounting debt and accelerating inequality that would culminate in revolution. This is not to say that Versailles should not have been built or that its preservation today is a mistake. History cannot be undone, and the palace has long since ceased to be an instrument of royal power and become instead a common inheritance, a place that belongs in some sense to everyone who wishes to experience it, to learn from it, to be moved by it. But the story of Versailles is inescapably a story about trade-offs. Every franc spent on gilding was a franc not spent elsewhere. Every peasant conscripted for construction was a peasant not working their own land. The magnificence that overawed visiting ambassadors was achieved by extracting wealth from a population that saw none of the magnificence and bore all of the extraction. Louis XIV understood that power requires performance, that visible grandeur can become a political instrument more effective than armies. He was, within his own terms, successful. He tamed the French nobility, consolidated royal authority, and presided over an era that France still remembers as the Grand Siècle, the Great Century. But he could not see what his success was building toward. The system he created, a system in which the nobility were neutralized through spectacle and debt, in which the crown's authority rested on the endless performance of magnificence, in which reform was structurally impossible because every privileged interest had a stake in the status quo. This system could not adapt. It could only continue or collapse. When the pressures became too great, when the debts were too large, the inequality too stark, the hunger too widespread, collapse came. And it came to Versailles first, to the very stage upon which the performance of power had played out for more than a century. The lesson of Versailles is not simple anti-luxury moralism. Great buildings, great art, great cultural achievements have value beyond their material cost. They express human aspiration. They create shared meaning. They transmit beauty across generations. These are not trivial accomplishments. But the lesson is also that magnificence extracted from populations without their consent, maintained by systems that resist all reform, and used to distract from rather than address the problems of governance, this magnificence is unsustainable. It may endure for a generation or two or even three, but eventually the bill comes due. Versailles today survives not because it is beautiful. Many beautiful things have been destroyed, but because successive generations found new purposes for it, new ways to justify its continued expense, new compromises that allowed its preservation without its original political function. The museum, the tourist destination, the film set, the event venue, these are all adaptations, all departures from the palace's original purpose that have nonetheless allowed it to continue. In this sense, Versailles has become something its builder never intended and might not have recognized. A democratic institution, open to the public, supported by a mix of public funds and private enterprise, governed by considerations of access and preservation rather than royal prerogative. Louis XIV built a monument to absolute monarchy. His heirs, after many convulsions, transformed it into something else, a monument to what absolute monarchy cost and a reminder of why such systems cannot endure. The golden rooms still gleam, the gardens still stretch toward the horizon, the fountains on designated days still send water arching into the air. But the meaning has changed. What was once a demonstration of power is now a museum of power. What was once a performance of magnificence is now an exhibition about what magnificence required. This transformation is the ultimate lesson. Great beauty does not survive on admiration alone. It does not persist because it deserves to persist. It survives only through continuous effort, perpetual adaptation, and endless compromise. Versailles endures today not because Louis XIV was a great king, though by some measures he was, but because generations of curators, gardeners, restorers, administrators, and funders have found ways to keep it alive. They have accepted that the palace can no longer be what it was. They have made peace with tourists trampling the floors, with gift shops in the servants' passages, with corporate logos attached to restoration projects. They have traded purity for survival. And perhaps that is the only trade that ever truly works. The alternative is not immaculate preservation, but oblivion. The palaces that refuse to adapt, the royal residences destroyed in revolutions, the aristocratic estates left to crumble, the great houses torn down for their materials, these are gone. Versailles remains, impure, compromised, commercialized, crowded, but still there, still teaching, still beautiful. The October morning of 1789 seemed like an ending. The mob at the gates, the Queen fleeing through secret passages, the royal family forced back to Paris. It was easy to believe that Versailles had reached its final chapter. But history does not end. It continues, transformed. The palace that was built to demonstrate the permanence of royal power instead demonstrates something else, that nothing is permanent, that everything changes, that survival requires adaptation. The fountains that once played only for kings now play for school children on field trips, for tourists from Tokyo and Toronto, for anyone with the price of admission. The gardens that were manicured for a single royal gaze now offer their beauty to millions. Perhaps this is not what Louis XIV wanted. But perhaps it is what Versailles was always meant to become, not a monument to a single reign, but a testament to what human beings can create, what those creations cost, and what it takes to keep them from disappearing entirely. The gilded surfaces catch the light, the water rises and falls, and every day, in workshops hidden from public view, restoration specialists continue the work of maintenance, repair, and preservation that has now lasted longer than the monarchy itself. The Sun King is long dead. His palace lives on, owned now by everyone and no one, sustained by the very public it was designed to exclude, enduring through the compromises he would never have made. That is the strange, paradoxical, and perhaps hopeful ending to a story that began with the ambitions of a frightened boy who grew up to reshape a nation in his own image, only to leave behind a palace that would ultimately reshape itself, and in doing so, survive what he never could, the judgment of those who came after. If Versailles was built to make royal power seem eternal and unquestionable, what does its survival as a public museum teach us about the unexpected afterlives of ambition? And what might the monuments of our own age become when our purposes are forgotten?